All right, well, Henry VIII. Henry VIII is part of a 2-century chapter of English history that's usually called Tudor-Stuart. So you know that 16th century England was under the Tudors, beginning with Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII, and Stuart England was the 17th century, and that was under the rule of the Stuarts, who actually came from Scotland. And so we're going to be looking in some detail at both of these because we, of course, as Americans, not to mention as Presbyterians, have a very significant interest in this chapter in history. In many ways, we're looking at the birth pangs of our own country and indeed to some degree of our own Presbyterian heritage. And so I don't want to be too rapid. At the same time, I don't want to pause too long. I want us to at least get a sense of what's going on. I have been somewhat less than enthusiastic, to be perfectly honest with you, about doing Henry VIII, but he is an interesting guy, and it is part of the story, and I think it does illustrate that God is actually in control of kings and the affairs of men, and so with that in mind, we'll take a look at this. The story begins actually with his father, Henry VII, who ruled in England from 1485 to 1509. Henry VII was the guy who came out on top in a series of conflicts called the Wars of Roses. After the 100 Years' War, in which England pretty much got beat up by France toward the end, you recall Joan of Arc and that whole discussion, England was trying to figure things out. There was a great deal of controversy among the noble families, the noble houses in England as to who exactly should be running the shop. There was a series of conflicts. A fairly unexpected guy rose to the top and more or less was able to take control of things, and this is the fellow we know of as Henry VII. He was of the House of Lancaster. Lancaster had the red rose. You can see it there in that picture. Maybe you can see it down. The Yorks were, of course, the white rose, and so it's called, isn't it a lovely name? The Wars of Roses. First time I heard that, I sort of imagined people throwing flowers at each other, you know. But there was a little bit more violence to it than that. But anyway, Henry VII comes out on top. He was a fairly astute ruler and realized that his chief competitor, the Yorks, needed somehow to be aligned with his rule, and so he tactically married Elizabeth, who was a princess of the family of York, and that at least brought those two families together, although there continued to be a huge amount of restiveness among the nobility in England. And a lot of people weren't so sure that Henry actually should be ruling, and that continued into the rule of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was paranoid, but just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not trying to get you, you know what I mean? And in the case of Henry, there were people trying to get him, and so he had good reason for his paranoia, but it actually began back here in the rather tumultuous era of these Wars of Roses and the process by which his father had become the ruler. Henry VII had 6 children, 4 of whom survived. The first was Arthur, the oldest, then Margaret, then Henry himself, and then Mary. And each of these is somewhat important. I want to take a little moment to look at them in just a second or two. Henry VII was ruling England, and England was not by any means at this point the biggest game in town. He realized that England had been spent through the 100 Years' War and various other sort of internal upheavals that had affected the sort of stability and climate of England, and he was looking for a big brother. He was looking for somebody with whom he could align himself that would secure England's fortunes. And of course, at that point, Spain was the most well-known, powerful European empire. It was under Isabella and Ferdinand. They had succeeded in driving the Moors out. You recall we talked about that story earlier. They were sending out the conquistadors around the world. Wealth was flowing in. And if you wanted a friend in the European family of nations, Spain would be the first choice. And so Henry VII was trying to figure out a way to align himself with Spain. And as it turns out, there was an eligible daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, their youngest, who was named Catherine, known as Catherine of Aragon. And so Henry arranged for Catherine to marry the heir apparent to the throne of England, whose name was Arthur. And so the two of them married. They were both quite young at the time, and so they had this kind of official marriage, though it didn't become actually a practical marriage. Arthur rather unexpectedly died. He was never in good health, but it was still somewhat unexpected, in 1502. So only about 15 weeks after the two of them had married, Arthur is dead, and Catherine is a young widow. And that put Henry VII into an awkward position, and of course Catherine was in a difficult position, and the entire circumstance gave rise to a huge amount of anxiety on the part of all concerned. And it was really in some ways that environment that was really the situation as Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509. Henry's older sister, Margaret, married James IV of Scotland. One of the best teachers I ever heard once said, "Repetition is the hallmark of education." And so I know sometimes we can get lost in the weeds here a little bit, but some of these connections are important. So I want to give this to you, just a little snippet, because we will come back and look at this, and it'll help if you've heard it once, even in this sort of truncated way. Margaret marries James IV. Scotland had been independent ever since the days of William Wallace. Scotland had been under the rule of, for the most part, that era, under the rule of a Stuart family. That was the name of the ruling house. James IV was one of a series of rulers with the last name Stuart. There was some interest in trying to realign the connection between England and Scotland, and so the thought was that if Margaret could marry James IV, then at least that would begin tying together this long-standing disrupted relationship between the two. And so that marriage took place, and the two of them had a son who became James V of Scotland. James V married a woman named Mary Guise, who was French, a French princess. France at this time, we'll look at this again in the future, so I'm just throwing this at you kind of quickly here. France at the time was under three noble families that dominated the French world: the Guise family, the Montmorency family, and the Bourbon family. The Bourbons were Protestant, the other two were Catholic. France itself is sort of up for grabs at this point as to what's going to become the dominant religion. Those are the three noble families. Guise is probably the most prominent of the three, so this was viewed as a real favorable alignment between Scotland and France, and Mary Guise marries now James V, and they have a child, their first and only child, whose name is Mary and comes to be known as Mary, Queen of Scots. She loses her father, James V, when she's about 5 days old, so she never knew him. And so she's basically the Queen of Scotland from the time of her birth on. And she, of course, is important to us because when we consider the career of John Knox, the founder of the Presbyterian Church, one of the most interesting aspects of his life is this interesting interaction he has with Mary, Queen of Scots. So that's kind of where she comes from. She has these connections to the ruling house in England and also in France. The younger sister, Mary, I'll just mention her briefly, she marries in the last 3 months of his life Louis XII, the predecessor of Louis XIII, the predecessor of Louis XIV, the most famous sort of despot of this era in Europe. Well, she marries him. He had never been able to produce a male heir, and she's young and vibrant, and the thought is this old man could maybe accomplish this. I'm trying to keep this Sunday school, I know, but you know how it is. And so he died in 3 months. The joke was he died of overexertion. There's also been a more sinister theory that Mary herself may have been responsible for her death, for his death, because she did not want this marriage and she did not love this man, and so she was really happy for him to die, and some people think she facilitated it to some degree, but we'll leave that for others to adjudicate. But in any event, she then married against without the knowledge of, and what would have been against the wishes of, her brother, Henry VIII, the man that she really loved, whose name was Charles Brandon. He was the first Earl of Suffolk. And they had children, and one of the grandchildren of Mary was Lady Jane Grey. And Lady Jane Grey is a very interesting, strong Christian who ruled England for about 5 days. And so we don't even include her on the list, but at least de facto, for a few days, she was the Queen of England. And we'll touch on her life a little bit later. All right, so the family. Arthur, of course, is dead at this point, and so Henry is now the King of England. He had all kinds of offices that were conferred upon him. He was the Duke of this and the Earl of that. You know how it goes. But his real training at this point was toward being a churchman. When Arthur was still alive, it was expected that Henry was going to be some kind of high official and likely would become a cardinal early on in the Catholic Church and would thereby have this sort of political position as well in England. At this point, Henry VII, his closest advisor was Cardinal Wolsey. There was no idea at this point in history, as you know, of a separation of church and state. The Catholic vision was a total merger of church and state, and that was implemented pretty effectively in many nations in Europe. And so in England, certainly that was the case. Wolsey was an older man, and it was expected that at some point he would die or retire, and I think the thought was that Henry VIII might step in and take over that role as an advisor to the king and also at the same time as a high churchman. So he received a very good theological education. Henry VIII was trained as a theologian, but he was not trained in the Bible. And that was the case in those days. To have a theological education meant you knew canon law, you knew church law, but you didn't necessarily know the actual content of the Bible. And so that was the general training that Henry received at this point. He was fluent in Latin, he was fluent in French, had a working knowledge of other languages. When Arthur died in 1502, Catherine and Arthur had only been married for 15 weeks. Almost overwhelming evidence supports the proposition that they were never intimate. They were too young, and so it was sort of an official marriage, but not a marriage in practice. Catherine maintained to the day of her death that that she was never, in the sense of the word, a wife to her husband Arthur, and that she came to the marriage to Henry VIII as a virgin. That became a rather critical issue as time went on, but anyway, that does seem to be the best evidence. The marriage between Henry and Catherine took place in 1509 based on an appeal by Wolsey to the Pope to grant a special dispensation. It violated canon law for someone in Henry's position to marry the widow of his deceased brother. And so the only way that could take place would be if the Pope blessed it, permitted it. Wolsey was able to achieve that, and so at the request of Henry VII, and without much enthusiasm on the part of Henry VIII, nevertheless, that marriage was transacted in 1509, the same year that Henry became the king. His early reign was typical of young, robust, male rulers of the day. He wanted to go out and get glory, and the best way to do that is at war. He wanted to go right the wrongs that he thought had taken place during the 100 Years' War. He wanted to go out and make a name for himself as a great warrior king. He wanted to do all this stuff, and basically all he accomplished was bankrupting the throne of England, you see. His father, Henry VII, had been a pretty good businessman, had been able to regroup financially the English sort of war chest, and so Henry inherited a fair amount of wealth, but in 10 years it was basically exhausted, and so that was essentially a rather financially unhappy early chapter in his reign. Nevertheless, during that time, he was trying to produce a male heir. That was probably his most important agenda item. He had, and as a result of that, 4 daughters who died and 3 sons who died. So 7 children died in his relationship with Catherine. He blamed Catherine. It was common in those days to believe it was the wife's fault, you know. The sex of the child and even the health of the child were all the fault of the mother. And so Henry was increasingly hostile toward Catherine. They had one child who survived, who was Mary Tudor, who eventually would become, from the Protestant epithet, Bloody Mary, you know. So she was the one surviving child of this marriage to Catherine. Interestingly, in 1521, the year of the Diet of Worms, Henry VIII wrote a fairly impressive piece of theological work defending the Catholic view against Martin Luther. It condemned Martin Luther, it criticized him theologically, it tried to show the errors that he had been promulgating and to defend the church against this rising heretical movement, as Henry saw it, of the Reformation there. The Pope, who was Giovanni de' Medici, Leo X, was so impressed and happy to have this English king supporting him so competently that he conferred upon Henry the title Defensor Fidei, Defender of the Faith. Later popes regretted that, but at the time, Henry thought this is great, and he continued to use that title throughout his career, even when he repudiated papal authority in England. He still was the Defensor Fidei, so that was kind of a critical moment for him and gave him a title he very much enjoyed. He was a bloody king. This is not all that unusual, so I don't want you to, attach too much significance to this, but there were thousands of executions under the reign of Henry VIII, most of them for political reasons. There was this noble class that was indeed plotting the overthrow of Henry, and many of these were discovered, and these people were summarily executed, and those who were associated with them. Others were religiously motivated. Henry was watching his backside all the time. He never felt very secure, especially in the early years of his reign. And to some degree, that probably explains some of the rather strange things that he did. The break from Rome took place over about a 15-year period, beginning in 1525. His increasing frustration with the inability, as he saw it, of Catherine to produce a male successor to the throne caused him to increasingly wonder if this marriage had been cursed by God. Maybe he never should have married his brother's wife, maybe notwithstanding the Pope's permission to enter this marital relationship, it was not God's plan, and maybe this was just punishment. That seems to have been what was going on in Henry's mind. And as he was increasingly concerned about it, it finally became what was called the king's great matter. That was the term of art that was used for his desire to end the relationship, the marriage to Catherine. Well, Wolsey was the one who had succeeded in getting that permission in the first place. Wolsey was the one who was going to go back to the Pope and undo it. And so the king said to Cardinal Wolsey, I want you to get the Pope's permission to divorce Catherine, or better yet, to just declare the marriage null. Because it was never a marriage. It was never properly entered. It was contrary to God's law, whatever. Wolsey knew this was going to be a tall order. He tried to find some end run. He couldn't. He went to the Pope. He knew the Pope would say no. He cashed in every bit of credit he had. He yanked every string he knew of. He did every manipulative maneuver you could think of, and it all was unavailing. The Pope was not about to disenfranchise Spain. Catherine was a Spaniard princess. She was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand. If the Pope had actually sanctioned this divorce, it would have been a slap in the face to the biggest cheerleader for the Pope in Europe at the time. He wasn't going to do that. In addition, the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire was a Spaniard. He was the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand. And there was a tight connection between Spain and Germany, the Holy Roman Empire at this point. And of course, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, was supporting the Pope against Martin Luther and the Reformers. The Pope didn't want to make him mad. France was the traditional ally of the Pope. He didn't want to side with England in any way that would disenfranchise France. So for political reasons that were virtually unending, the Pope said, no possible way am I going to let Henry out of this marriage. Wolsey told him, "You're going to lose Henry." The Pope didn't believe it. He didn't think even Henry would have that much gumption. And so he simply said no. And for that reason, Henry fired Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was essentially exiled for his failure to achieve what Henry had ordered, and Wolsey died shortly thereafter. And I think no one knows this for sure, but the best evidence is that Wolsey, knowing that that was the end of any hope he had of a further career, committed suicide. About the same time, there was a scholar who was very prominent in the university system in England, whose name was Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell thought to himself, now he was a strong follower of the Reformation. He was also an astute politician. And he thought to himself, maybe we could cook up kind of an arrangement that would actually make Henry more sympathetic to the Protestant side of things and at the same time give him what he really wants, this divorce from Catherine. So Thomas Cromwell came to Henry and proposed a different approach. Henry, instead of seeking a divorce from the Pope, why don't you put the question to the universities? Now remember, the universities had sort of risen independent of the Catholic Church. They gave lip service to their loyalty to the Catholic Church, but the universities had grown out of the free cities that were produced really in the late part of the Crusades and thereafter, and these were free universities. And a lot of free thinkers populated these universities who didn't feel quite so bound by the rules of the church or the rules of the Pope. They felt free to sort of engage in a little bit more of a free thinking approach to academic matters. And that was part of the complex nature of the academic world at the time. And so Cromwell suggested, let's put the question to theological scholars in the universities of Europe and see what they say to the question. And Henry thought that was a great idea. And so the question went out. Well, the two main schools in England, Oxford and Cambridge, came back almost immediately in support of the legitimacy of Henry's view. This is an illegitimate marriage. It never was a marriage. It should never have happened, and you can freely separate yourself from Catherine. It was a mixed report from the other universities, but it gave Henry sufficient reason to think that he could go ahead and do this and have at least some degree of support among those who were in the upper echelons of the social order of the day, especially in Europe. And so that's exactly what he did. And in the process, Thomas Cromwell was advanced into one of the highest posts, becoming an advisor to Henry in his administration for some years thereafter, until, of course, Thomas Cromwell was executed, as most people that worked for Henry wound up being executed. I don't know. But anyway, that's what Thomas Cromwell became, something like the chancellor then for a while under Henry. Henry, of course, had already spotted one of the ladies in waiting who served in Catherine's court, a woman by the name of Anne Boleyn, and so he married her. By the time they married, she was already pregnant. He was sure this was the son that he was hoping for, and so he was very, very celebrative. The English people were not quite so sanguine about the whole thing, but nevertheless, they did marry. The break from Rome took place in 1535 in what's called the Act of Supremacy, in which Parliament declared that the king is the true head of the church in England rather than the Pope. And so this is the official break with Rome. And everything that Wolsey had predicted, of course, took place, and the Catholic Church was aware of it, but at this point they just hoped that public opinion would bring England back sooner or later. At the same time, of course, you know the name Thomas More. He had been one of the closest advisors to Henry. The requirement was by Henry that everybody would sign a kind of loyalty oath in which they would acknowledge that the Act of Supremacy was correct and that the king is the true head of the church. Thomas More refused to sign. Most of the others who were in the court of Henry, the scholars, all of those folks that really mattered out there signed it because they knew that the consequences were grim at best. Thomas More, to his credit, was unwilling to sign it. He's one of the great sort of principled Roman Catholics of the day. I differ with him theologically, but I do admire him in terms of his ethic, in terms of his deep principle. And of course, he was eventually sainted by the Catholic Church. But he went to his death just refusing to sign his name to a document in which he would part company with the Pope and give allegiance to the king. So that opened up that position. It really was Thomas Cromwell who filled the role that had been held by Thomas More earlier. Anne Boleyn, of course, gave birth to a bouncing baby girl, and we know her as Elizabeth. And so we have now two children. We have Mary Tudor, and Elizabeth Tudor, still no son. And so Henry is, of course, becoming increasingly frustrated. He did, as you probably know, eventually have a son, Edward, by his third wife, Jane Seymour. At this time, the North in England rebelled. This is probably one of the most critical moments in Henry's reign, in which the outcome was really not altogether certain. The upper echelons of English society were pretty hostile to the Pope. Now, they were polite about it, but ever since the 100 Years' War, ever since the Avignon papacy, ever since the Pope had more or less been politically throwing his support behind the French and against the English, there had been a kind of brewing resentment toward the papacy. John Wycliffe had capitalized on that. We talked about his story earlier. It had never gone away. There was a kind of cynicism and skepticism in England, especially in her elite classes, the nobility, the scholars, the universities, and so on, that just didn't think much of the Pope. However, in the more rural parts of England, which tended to be much more conservative, there was no question that the Pope was the true head of the church. And this decision that had been made, this act of supremacy, was sufficient to stimulate a huge revolt in the north of England. And this was, as I say, probably the greatest crisis that was faced by Henry. He put this revolt down with just ghastly forms of punishment, executions of men, women, and children, hung, burned, staked, virtually every kind of gruesome and ghastly form of punitive responses to this took place during this couple of years. Henry was capable of the most ferocious kinds of violence to secure his throne, and this was certainly an ugly chapter, although maybe from Henry's point of view it was unavoidable. The other little detail of what happens at this point is connected to the Tyndale Bible. I mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about William Tyndale that he had translated the Bible into English. It was being smuggled into England. It was illegal at the time that it was coming in. Tyndale was killed in 1536. His last words were, "Please God, open the eyes of the King of England." 2 years later, Henry VIII opened the door for the Tyndale Bible, which had been illegal to that point, to be a copy to be placed in every church in England. So God steers the hearts of kings, you know. Now I have to say this, Henry didn't know what he was doing. He'd never read the Bible much. He thought the Bible was sort of a book about being nice, being submissive, being kind, being loving. He thought having a Bible in all the churches and having people read it would just turn these folks into a bunch of hippies, just kind of love, peace, everything's fine. It was one of the most astonishing reversals of expectation that he could possibly have imagined. Because it is the case, my friends, whenever people start reading the Bible, it lights something in their soul. It lights in them the fire of human dignity and human worth and of human liberty, of thought and of expression. These are all biblical ideas that are fostered by ordinary folks like you and me reading the Bible. And one of the odd things that happened in England at this time is as ordinary folks started reading the Bible, the ale houses, which had earlier just been a place where people went and partied and got drunk, became debating centers in which they were talking about what's the Bible about and what does it mean and how should we do this and what do you think's the best answer to that. And these ongoing robust conversations enlivened the English people to such a degree that it sort of generated an entirely new spirit of a vision of what English liberty might look like. Henry realized a little too late that he had made a huge mistake. Instead of creating a docile population, he had created a population that was just now, and the cat was out of the bag. There was nothing he could do about it. It was way too late. Even though he tried to yank those Bibles back in, it was not going to happen. So in any event, 1538, Henry opened the doors to the Tyndale Bible, and that was quite a moment. All right, well, his final years, here's how he's looking about a year before his death. Poor guy. He was very portly and very, very poor health, but in any event, his last wife, we'll look at the 6 wives in a minute just for fun, but the last of his 6 wives was Catherine Parr. She was quite a committed follower of the Protestant Reformation. She seems to have been a very sincere Christian, and she was also very devoted to Henry and wanted him to do the right things. He had virtually succeeded in doing bad things to virtually every relationship in his family, and she took quite a role in trying to help Henry reconcile himself to Mary, who had been in a kind of exile, Elizabeth, who had not been treated too well as well, and she really played quite a role in the latter 2 or 3 years of his life. Henry died in any event at the age of 55, multiple health issues, and he was succeeded then by his son, Edward, who was born of his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, who, of course, Henry, probably in the great scheme of things, viewed as his favorite. She was the only one who didn't really come to a bad end, except for Catherine herself. Jane Seymour died in childbirth, giving birth to Edward, the one male heir that he'd been hoping for so many years. So here are the 6 wives. Just we couldn't do Henry without talking about it. Catherine of Aragon is first. This is, of course, Anne Boleyn. She gives us Elizabeth. Then we have Jane Seymour. She gives us Edward. Then we have, now this gets trickier. Anybody know this one? Anne of Cleves is right. Anne of Cleves was a marriage arranged by Thomas Cromwell, trying to align Henry with what was called the Protestant League, rooted largely in the Holy Roman Empire. She was Protestant, and Thomas Cromwell was hoping that this would sort of edge Henry toward more of a Protestant view of things. Didn't work out so well. Henry didn't like her. He never really had a marriage with her, but he treated her reasonably well, regarded her as his sister. That was her official title. Put in a nice little sort of home like an exile, but really there was no marriage there. It only lasted for less than a year. 5th was Catherine Howard, who seems to have been, if I can use this somewhat impolite term, sort of a floozy, but she was executed for infidelity, as was Anne Boleyn. In the case of Anne Boleyn, the charge was perfectly specious. In the case of Catherine Howard, not so much. So, any event. Then the last one, of course, is Catherine Parr. And so there they are, the 6 wives of Henry VIII. I'd like to, in the limited time we have left here, talk a little bit about Anne Askew. Anne Askew lives and dies in the very tail end of the reign of Henry, and she has an interesting story, and it's only one of several we could pull out, but I just wanted, by way of illustrative purposes, to use her to talk about kind of what was happening in a different level of English society. She was born in 1520 to a sort of mid-level gentry family, kind of semi-noble, not exactly noble, but the landed gentry was kind of rising at that point in English history, and so she was born into that sort of middle-class situation. She was married, forced to be married at age 15 to a brutal and abusive man by the name of Thomas Kyme. And so that was not a happy marriage. So she's 15 years old. So that puts us at 1535. And remember, the Tyndale Bible became available in 1538. And she was literate. She'd been well educated. And she immediately, when the Tyndale Bible was available, she already had one because they were widely distributed in England, even as illegal documents. She was a serious student of the Scriptures. And by the time she's around 30, 35 years old, she is actually publicly preaching, kind of a street corner preacher, in which she is preaching the Bible as she understands it. She doesn't have a sophisticated theological education, but she's a very bright woman. And she gets a hold of the fundamental message of the Scriptures and preaches in a way that's quite critical of the Church of England at that time, believing that even though they were Protestant, technically they were still way too Catholic in practice and belief. And so that's sort of the long and short of her message at that point. Her husband, I neglect to mention, she became, her husband threw her out when she was 25 years old. Because of her public activities, and so it was just she was out in the cold like that. She was taken in by a woman who was a friend of Catherine Parr, and she actually became part of Catherine Parr's inner circle. And they had what amounts to what we might call a home Bible study, So Catherine Parr had this little circle of women who were close to her. It included Anne Askew, and they would get together and read the Bible and sometimes invite in somebody from the university who would come and explain texts to them and so on. But all of this was very much aligned with the Reformation tradition and that view of things. And Anne Askew became quite a prominent member of that. In 1545, we've reached a political point in England where the Reformation, which is critical, that is, the Reformation forces in England are critical of the Church of England created by Henry, and there are folks out there who want to, with whatever level of violence is necessary, put down this Reformation spirit. It had been inspired to some degree by the Tyndale Bible, by the reading of Martin Luther and Calvin and others, and so you have a kind of subculture in England that is very devoted to the Reformation, and then you have the Church of England, which is very, very Catholic from their point of view. And Anne Askew, being so close to the Queen, was viewed as one who could be used as a pawn to try to incriminate some of these women who were also close to the Queen, maybe even Catherine Parr herself. Henry had been turning a blind eye to this. He knew what his wife was up to, but he really liked her. He didn't want to get her in trouble, and so he hadn't been pursuing this much. But there were forces out there who wanted to use Anne Askew as a kind of sort of a mechanism to incriminate others, and they thought they could get her to break under trial and torture and so on. So she was arrested, and she was tried in a heresy trial. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of the trial transcript here. It gives you a little insight into Anne Askew and also to the mentality of the folks who were part of this Reformation movement in England at this very early stage. So the prosecutor asked her this question: "Why did you say that you would rather read 5 lines in the Bible than hear 5 masses?" Which she had publicly said in sermons many times. Anne answered, "Because the one helps me greatly and the other does nothing at all." The prosecutor said, "Have you the Spirit of God in you?" She answered, "If I don't, I am unsaved and without hope." The prosecutor said, "Do you think private masses help the souls of those who have died?" She answered, "It is a great idolatry to believe them to be of more value than the death that Christ died for us." The prosecutor said, "You foolish woman. In the Mass, after the priest says the words of consecration over the bread, does it not become the Lord's body?" Transubstantiation. She answered, "No, it is but consecrated or sacramental bread." Prosecutor said, "Well, what if a mouse should eat it after the priest's consecration? What do you say, foolish woman, would become of the mouse?" She answered, "What do you say would become of it, my lord?" He answered, "I say the mouse is damned." She answered, "Ah, poor mouse." Quite a personality. In her trial, she made this comment: "The crux of the matter was the Lord's Supper." transubstantiation. And these were a couple of comments she made. Quote, "I believe that as oft as I in Christian congregation receive the bread in remembrance of Christ's death, and with thanksgiving according to his holy institution, I receive therewith the fruits also of his most glorious passion." She said, in answer to a question about Jesus' statement, "This is my body," which of course was very important. "This is my body" was taken to be a justification of transubstantiation. She said these words concerning that statement, quote, "Christ's meaning in this passage is similar to the meaning of those other places of Scripture. Quote, I am the door. I am the vine. Behold the Lamb of God. That rock was Christ," and other such references to himself. You are not in these texts to take Christ for the material thing which he is signified by, for then you would make him a very door, a vine, a lamb, a stone, quite contrary to the Holy Ghost's meaning. All these indeed do signify Christ, even as the bread signifies his body in that place. Not a bad answer, you see, for a non-theologically trained student of the Scriptures. She was found guilty and tortured. The torture of choice was the rack. The rack was turned to such a point that her ligaments were completely stretched to the point that there was no restoration of her even ability to walk. All of this time she was being required, the demand was being placed upon her to incriminate, to say of these other associates of Catherine Parr that they were followers of the Reformation. She was supposed to be giving evidence against others who were even closer to the Queen in the hopes of discrediting the Queen and discrediting the whole Reformation movement. In the face of unbelievable and ghastly pain and torture, she adamantly refused. On one occasion, she came back to her cell, unable to walk but able to write, and she penned the following short poem. She said, quote, "Like as the armed knight appointed to the field, with this world I will fight, and faith shall be my shield. On thee my care I cast, for all their cruel spite. I set not be their haste, for thou art my delight." She was burned at the stake. She had to be carried to the stake because she was unable to walk because of the effects of torture. On July 15th, in July 1546. A couple of things about Anne Askew just as final remarks. She is the only woman on record known to have been both tortured in the Tower of London and burned at the stake. Only woman who ever went through all of that. She is chronologically, as far as we know, the earliest female poet to have composed in the English language. So her poem is the first that we've ever discovered of a woman doing poetry. She's also the first English woman to have demanded a divorce based on an innocent party on scriptural grounds. So she's quite a woman. I mean, she defines several different rather significant aspects of this rising part of the Reformation movement. Well, Solomon said, he was a king himself. Can I read it without my glasses? Maybe. "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wills." I know that every one of us in this room, have our religious and political and economic outlook, and I'm sure we don't all agree on a lot of different topics. But I hope we can all concur in this: God is sovereign. And that even when we feel in the immediate context of particular moments of history that things are spinning out of control, that we can nevertheless return to the foundational truth that in this universe there's not one renegade molecule. God, I heard someone say once, draws straight using crooked lines. There have been a lot of crooked lines down through history, and yet God is using them to draw a straight line pointing to Christ, in whom all things will ultimately come together to the glory of God and to the praise of Christ. And even when we may not like what the king is doing, or what the Congress is doing, or what the president's doing, or what the prime minister is doing, or what the chancellor is doing, or what any other person that seems to be running our lives is doing, we can rest in this great truth, that God is God, and that God is sovereign, and that he ain't going to lose in history. So Henry, we appreciate the story you told, but we're happy to report that in the final analysis, even Henry served great purposes for good in the unfolding story of God's people.